Thank you for the warm reception. It's a genuine pleasure to be here. For someone who has worked in behavioral insights since probably the inception of behavioral insights in government, it's a very warm and pleasing feeling to see it spreading across the world with the ability to bring positive outcomes for citizens and the improvement of public services worldwide. Today I'm going to talk to you about the experience of the UK and other countries where we've worked in helping administrations bring a more behavioral focus to the delivery of public service. I'm going to start by introducing what behavioral insights means and then give you some practical examples from different policy areas of how we've used a behavioral approach to improve public service outcomes. So, first of all, I want to explain what behavioral insights is not. Traditionally, we have three levers of government. We have regulation, law and enforcement, so we can compel people to do different things. We have incentives or disincentives like tax, so we put high taxes on cigarettes to stop people smoking, and we reduce taxes for things that we want people to do. Information, traditional campaigns telling people this is when you should complete your registration forms by, to try and encourage people to do something at a certain time. Now, the behavioral approach is not an alternative to any of those levers. It's a means of informing them to make them more effective. What do we mean by behavioral insights? Well, at its heart, behavioral insights is a combination of four things. We have psychology, a nuanced understanding of why people make decisions. Ethnography, which is trying to understand what life is like from the perspective of the end user. So if a citizen walks into a job center or a school, trying to understand actually what is their experience like, rather than assuming what it's like from our positions in government. Behavioral economics. Behavioral economics, a big topic, but really it's the growing understanding that the classical economics way of predicting human decision-making has more nuance to it. So, whereas previously we may have thought that people take decisions in order to maximize the benefits for themselves. For example, I should have a pension because I know that when I'm older and I'm not able to earn money, a pension will support me. That's economically rational and sensible behavior, but behavioral economics is the acceptance that people don't always make those decisions. So if you ask people in the UK, almost everyone, almost universally, people agree that it's a good idea to have a pension, yet people don't all have pensions. And the difference between what they say they should do and what they ought to do and what they actually do is where behavioral economics comes to life. So in the UK, we made a quite significant change actually a few years ago, where rather than allowing people to opt in to a pension when they join a large company, a lot of companies have private pension schemes, we changed that opt-in to an opt-out. So when you join a large company, you automatically have a pension, and if you don't want it, you have to say no, rather than saying, I do want one. You with me? Now that change moved the proportion of people who had pensions working at large companies from 63% to 83%. It's not changing anyone's intention or their mindset. It's merely changing the way the choices are presented to them. Okay. But if I was to sum all of that up, behavioral insights is about understanding how people behave in practice. What that means is designing situations where we can observe people and measure them, and then gleaning from that insights as to what drives behavior, rather than making theories about how people will behave according to what they think is good for them. What I intended to do was to demonstrate this with a game. Does anyone want to play a game? Good. So it's a memory test. Everyone has in front of them a pad of paper. Don't use it yet, but be prepared to use it. I'm going to ask you to look at the screen for a few seconds and try and remember what's on it. Are you ready? Okay, now look at the screen. Right. There you go. Can everyone write down as many images as you can remember? Got about 20 seconds left. Ten seconds. Okay. Now, please will you put your hand up if you got at least 4? Who can remember at least 4? 5? Keep it up if you got 6, 7, 8, 9. It's pretty good. 10. All right. That's an above average performance, I'm not going to lie. Done this in many countries. All right. Can you put your hand up if you got Apple? Okay, now can people look around to see roughly how many people got Apple? So keep your hand up if you got Apple, right? I want you to have an idea of how many people. Now put your hand up if you got helicopter. Same thing, look around. I'm going to ask you to detect a pattern. Policeman? See who got policeman? Music? Same thing. Dog? See who got dog? Golf. Does anyone know what the pattern is? Because it's worked again perfectly. Does anyone know what it is? Okay, so roughly twice as many people got apple, policeman, and dog than got helicopter, music, and golf. And wherever I do this, it's the same. And the reason for that is that the first 3 were shown at either the beginning or the end of the sequence. The second 3 were shown somewhere in the middle of the sequence. This seems very basic, but stuff at the beginning or the end of a communication is much more potent for us to remember. That sounds obvious when I say it, but when we think about government communication, how often is the really salient part of the communication the action of what we want citizens to do at the beginning or the end of the sentence? We've tested this in a number of scenarios and found that communication is much more effective when you put the specific action points at the beginning or the end, and not just what you want citizens to do, but how they should do it. So, let me give you some more examples. This is from a street in Amsterdam. You see 80 or so bicycles chained up against a wall. All the bicycles have been flyered. Some sort of advert attached to the bicycle. Now, no one really wants a flyer on their bicycle, and the temptation is to discard it, but we know that discarding things is bad. There's what we call a social norm against littering. There's nothing actually to prevent us doing so. There's no person stopping us. There's no sign. We just know that it's bad. Now, in both the scenarios, there's graffiti. Sorry, there's a sign saying no graffiti, but in one of the scenarios, that sign has been violated. So the social norm, the expectation of how we should behave, has been violated. And what experimenters wanted to test was whether or not the violation of one social norm would lead to the violation of another social norm. And what they found is that when they measured the number of people who threw away the flyers, who littered, who broke a social norm, it was double. So with no other information, nothing, just the violation of one social norm, completely unrelated to the other, it led to the violation of another social norm. That's what we mean by behavioral science. So we need to think differently about behavior. What's going on here? Now, 3 or 4 decades ago, a very influential psychologist called Professor Daniel Kahneman wrote about there being 2 systems of thought within the brain. One is an automatic system of thought. That's what he calls system 1. and one is a more reflective system of thought, system 2. So when I say, what's 2 times 2, you think 4 immediately. You don't process it, you just know, it's almost intuitive. That's us acting with our automatic system of thought. If I say, what's 24 times 17, most people, barring maybe the person who got 10 on the memory test, won't bother to work it out, because it requires effort, it's much harder. If we're choosing something to eat from a menu, we're using our system 2, it's reflective. If we're taking a familiar commute on the way to work, we're using system 1, it becomes automatic and intuitive. Now what Kahneman said was that actually the majority of our actions are governed or influenced by our system 1. 80% of our actions are influenced by our system 1, our automatic way of thinking. So all these decisions we're taking, all this behavior, is not actively thought about in a way that maybe as policymakers we would have assumed. So the question then for policymakers is, how do we influence the automatic system? And it turns out that the environment, the way choices are presented to us, the way we feel at a point of making a decision, is far more consequential to the outcome of that decision than sometimes the pros and cons of that particular decision. So, what I've presented to you previously is what we would refer to as circumstantial examples. So, coming back to your bicycle, seeing a flyer on the bicycle, it's a circumstantial thing. But what about when people are actually asked to engage with information and to make a decision? This is an experiment from Australia, where at the University of Western Sydney, David Tate and collaborators took 500 jurors in a mock case, a mock trial, and asked them to decide whether or not the defendant, was guilty. Now, there were 3 conditions, and every condition was exactly the same. The same actors, the same script, everything was the same. The only difference was that in one condition, the defendant was presented in a glass cage, in another condition, in the open dock, and finally, US style, at the bar table. They then measured what the different guilty verdicts would be. And what they found was a considerable difference in guilty verdicts, even though the cases were all the same. It was just the way the defendant was presented. So even when we're asked to actively engage with information, we see that the way choices are presented can have deeply consequential impacts on the outcomes of our decisions. Now, excuse me for this slightly morbid slide, but this is on suicide. This line shows the suicide rate in the UK between the late 50s and the mid-70s. You can see that it's a reduction of around 30%. Now, we didn't see that reduction in comparable economies over that period of time. Does anyone know what might be driving this reduction? It wasn't the economy. What's notable is that at the first part of this graph, 50% of all suicides happened as a result of breathing in carbon monoxide poisoning, because houses at that time were heated by synthetic gas. When you burn gas, it creates carbon monoxide, and if you breathe it in, you slowly die. But during the course of this time, Britain discovered gas in the North Sea, and over that period of time, all houses became heated with natural gas. Now, when you burn natural gas, it does not create carbon monoxide. So you cannot use that option for suicide. So what we find, this gray line is the number of suicides conducted by natural gas, and this is the overall suicide rate. What we find is that the reduction of that option of suicide reduces suicide altogether. So even the most consequential decision that you could possibly think of is affected by the way options are presented. It's not changing the rational decision-making process, it is merely an environmental factor. So, how did this come about in UK government? Well, in 2010, we had a coalition government where the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister included this important message, which hopefully will appear behind me. Our government will find intelligent ways to encourage, support, and enable people to make better choices for themselves. So we're providing information in a different way that will enable people to make better choices for themselves rather than trying to coax or compel. And the Prime Minister at the time started a very small unit. There are actually 7 of us working inside the Cabinet Office and Number 10 to think about how we can apply this type of thinking to public policy across all different public policy realms. What then happened, it's important to know that we had key figures of the administration behind us. We can talk about this in the discussion. The setup isn't so important for this particular part. What is more important is that at the beginning, there was quite negative reception to this type of work in the press. Reasonably understandably, the press was skeptical that this was going to be effective, thought it was perhaps a waste of money. This chap here was writing a blog every day suggesting that we should all be fired. He didn't get an invitation to the Christmas party. But more recently, the press has become a lot more positive. As you can see behind us, the headlines championing this approach, and it's been a real turnaround. And for me, the main reason for that is the second element of what we do at the Behavioral Insights team, and that's experimentation and the use of evidence. So, has anyone ever heard of a randomized control trial? Great. At least one person. The premise of a randomized control trial is that you conduct an intervention or you design some element of public policy, public service, in a way that allows you to measure its effectiveness more robustly by comparing what would have happened had you not designed that intervention or public policy. So the way it does that is by taking a large sample, big population of people, and randomly splitting them in two. The randomization is important. If we randomize effectively, then we can be sure, reasonably sure, that there are no systematic similarities or differences between the groups. So it's not just the one group is older, younger, more rich, more northern, more female, more male, whatever. They're exactly the same because they have been randomly split. And if the population is big enough, all those differences get merged. So what we then do is we take one group, one randomized group, and assign them the old policy. So what would have happened had we done nothing? So let's say it's employment. We have an existing employment scheme trying to get people into work. We randomize people and keep them in that business as usual context. But then with the other group, we tried the behavioral insights policy. So a small tweak to whatever the delivery of the public service might be. We then measure the outcomes. And if we find that, in this example, we have 4 grey men and women in the behavioral insights group and 3 grey men and women in the existing group, then something has happened. And because we've randomized, because we're sure that there are no differences between the groups, we can be sure that the different outcome is to do with the intervention. So let me give you an actual example. In the UK, most people pay their taxes. Actually, we're a quite compliant society, and the reason for that is that we have criminal sanctions for those who don't pay, we have financial penalties, and we have lots of information campaigns reminding people to pay. Now, this particular example is about tax, but actually it's the behavior, it's the compliance that's the critical issue here. Even though we have these 3 levers, traditional levers of government, still about 1 million people don't pay their taxes on time, which is a big number. So we have a randomized control trial approach. Randomize people into different groups, and then we treat people differently. We have different types of communications for different groups, and we measure the outcomes. So one of the things we tested was to write letters to them phrased differently. If you don't pay your taxes the first time, you get a letter, and the letter basically says, you haven't paid, please pay, except in bureaucratic language. We included an extra line in that letter which says 9 out of 10 people have already paid their taxes, which is true. We then measure whether or not people who received that message were more likely to pay than people who received other messages. Understand? This is a simple randomized control trial. But the results are interesting. So what we find is that the proportion of people, this is just sent to the people who had not paid, don't forget. The proportion of people who received the business as usual letter, 33.6% of them went on to pay. The proportion of people who received a letter that had just one additional line of information saying 9 out of 10 people pay their taxes on time, you see a small but significant increase of 2 percentage points. We then adapt that, 9 out of 10 people in your town, a bit more, 9 out of 10 people with a debt like yours, finally 9 out of 10 people in your area with a debt like yours have already paid their taxes on time. That leads to a 6 percentage point increase, which, in a country the size of the UK, amounts to a large sum of money. But the most important point here is we've not invested really any more money in trying to encourage that compliance. It's just changing the way a letter is written. And the letter's already being sent out anyway. So that one line made a substantial increase in compliance. So across the course of 12 months, several trials lead to a significant impact, as you can see. Now, just a little bit more about the team. In 2014, when we were part of the Cabinet Office, we took the decision, and the Prime Minister at the time allowed us to spin out of government. Perfect, thank you. This is very unusual. So the Behavioural Insights team is no longer part of the UK government. In a weird way, the UK government is part of us, because they remain a shareholder, but we have spun out to become an independent organisation, allowing us to work with a broader range of partners interested in delivering public services and improving outcomes for citizens from schools, hospitals in the UK, but also foreign governments. So we now work in these countries and have been able to open offices around the world, moving from, I think, 7 employees when we were in Cabinet Office to just under 200 now. So I say this as an example of how behavioural insights is spreading and how the discipline is emerging as something useful in government. This is a slide from the OECD, which shows how many other countries are using this approach. A lot of these organizations are very, very small, 1 or 2 people, but some of them are quite large. And it really gives you a sense that behavioural insights is something which is here to stay. So, building on the example I showed before, it's quite a simple example of tax. Does this approach translate to very different cultures where perhaps the likelihood of paying tax is not quite as high as in the UK? So in this example, working with the World Bank in Guatemala. Now people say there are 2 truths in Latin America, death and taxes. But as you can see behind me, there are a substantially lower proportion of GDP raised from taxes in Guatemala. Now in the UK it's about, I think, 36. So this just gives you an example that it's a very different context. So what did we do? Well, the same approach. We adapted the communication sent to people who failed to pay their tax. In this instance, we use a pure control, so we're able to test the impact of on people who don't receive any letter at all. Writing in Spanish, I'll have you know, we then measure the effect of people, measure effect of tax payment. So the proportions are much lower here. Control, this is a pure control, so no letter received. For the people who received the tax letter that was sent by the Guatemalan Tax Authority, 4.3% went on to pay. The behavioral letter was a simplified version, so that's what I said earlier about the information up front and at the end. National pride. So this letter included a Guatemalan flag with the phrase saying, your country needs you, needs to pay your taxes, etc. Incidentally, we tried that in the UK with the British flag, didn't work. Deliberate choice. So this says, this letter was, previously we've considered your failure to pay a mistake, but from now we will consider it an active choice. And finally, social norms, as I mentioned before. So it wasn't true to say 9 out of 10 people, because that's not what the data told us, but it was true to say 6 out of 10 people. So that's what we said. And as we can see, a 43% increase in compliance. But what's important here is not the compliance, it's actually the amount paid. So that's a moderate increase. But when you see the amount paid per letter, then you start to see the value of this approach. A 4-fold increase just by changing the language of a letter. This next slide shows the compliance rate a year later with no other intervention. So actually, we're developing habits as well. So this can be applied across a broad range of areas, and in the UK, we work across pretty much the full spectrum of public policy. I'm going to pick out some examples in health and education for you now, and then we can discuss it at the end. So, another game. In the UK, most people say they want to allow their organs to be used when they die for other people who may need them. In fact, it's like 85, 90% in surveys, yet the number of people who have actually registered on the organ donor registry is very low. So it's that difference between intention and action that is, again, where behavioral insights is most effective. So what do? In this instance, we look for a touch point where citizens are going to be receiving some sort of information anyway, and see if we can nudge them into a particular course of action. And that touch point was this. This is a DVLA website. This is where you license your taxi, get your driving license. And you can also pay your road tax. About 1 million people pass through this every month. And the reason for this, we chose DVLA, is because it's a high threshold, it's online, so it's quite simple to make adaptations. So you go through the process of registering your license or whatever it is you're doing on there, and at the end, you get an additional message. And the message is designed to prompt you to join the organ donor register. But because we don't know which message is best, again, we can experiment. So we have 8 options. Which do you think worked best? Thank you, please join the organ donor register. Thank you, please join the organ donor register. Every day, thousands of people who see this page decide to register. The same message as that, but with a picture of smiley, happy people. The same message, but with a picture of the organ registry logo. Or, thank you, 3 people die every day because there are not enough organ donors. It's quite persuasive. Thank you, you could save or transform up to 9 lives as an organ donor. Thank you, if you needed an organ transplant, would you have one? If so, please help others. And finally, if you support organ donation, turn your support into action. Who thinks, well, let me say, who thinks number 2 was more effective? Number 3, the social norm plus picture, okay. By the way, in a vote in the Behavioral Insights team, that's the one we thought would be more effective. Number 4, norm and logo, 3 die every day. Number 6, 9 lives. Number 7, reciprocity. That's if you needed an organ transplant, would you have one? Or finally, number 8, if you support organ donation, please turn your support into action. One of the beautiful things about this approach is that you can actually have this game for real with your colleagues before it's done and predict which one would be most effective. So what we find is that the control, 2.3% of people. Turn your support into action, that's a big difference. The social norm, 2.9%. The norm with the logo, I actually didn't think this would work, but it worked quite well. 9 lives are saved, 3 die every day. The reciprocity, I can't remember who got reciprocity, but well done. The norm and picture, which we all thought would be most effective, didn't work. Oh well. And that just goes to show the importance of experimentation. Again, an extra 100,000 people joined the register as a result of this very simple intervention. Okay. Again, we move from the kind of circumstantial decision-making to the active choice decision-making. How do we change the behavior of doctors who are paid to make decisions, who go through years of training to help them understand how to make decisions? Antimicrobial resistance is a huge issue and becoming an even greater issue. It happens when essentially too many antibiotics are prescribed and people develop a resistance to them. And this is problematic because eventually there will be diseases that become much more difficult to treat. So how do we change doctors' behaviors in terms of antibiotic prescriptions without really engaging them and retraining? And doctors, of course, in the UK essentially are able to make decisions for themselves. There's a limited influence that the state can have over them. So we write to them from the chief medical officer, and we just let them know, this letter was sent to the upper quintile, so the 20% who are over-prescribing in London compared to a baseline. And we say, the great majority of practices in London are prescribing fewer than you per head. We offer them specific actions. This is what you can do instead of prescribing antibiotics. And finally, it's signed by the chief medical officer. One of the things that we give doctors or we remind doctors that they can do to give instead of antibiotics is this leaflet, which essentially allows someone to pick up a prescription later if their symptoms don't improve as a result of a non-antibiotic prescription treatment. And this is what we see. So the blue line is the antibiotics prescribed to the, by doctors who had not received the letter. As you can see, there's a big spike during winter when more people are ill. And the orange line is the people who received the letter. So that's almost a 1 percentage point reduction in prescription rates just by a letter. So as you can see, this is really feedback. It's just telling doctors, we're not telling them off. We're just telling them that, did you know you're prescribing more than most people in London? So, as you can see behind me, it was quite an effective letter. Here's an example of a piece of work that we did in another country. So this is working in Moldova. Now, in Moldova, it's the poorest country in Europe, many serious problems. One of them is tuberculosis. And the means of treating tuberculosis is by requiring patients of tuberculosis to come to doctor surgeries every day and be observed taking their medication. And they receive an incentive to do this. This is prescribed by law. Yet there's quite a low compliance rate. People don't turn up. How can we make it as easy as possible for patients to receive their information? So, thinking about it, many patients who have tuberculosis in Moldova, their worst problem is not the fact they have tuberculosis. They have many other problems, and there are factors that impede their ability to make it to a doctor's surgery every day. So we try a different approach. We give them a tablet. It actually wasn't an iPad, but it was some form of tablet. And we say, okay, what we can do is give you a month's worth of tablets, and you take a tablet every day and take a video of it and send it to us, actually send it to the doctor's surgery, and the nurse then looks at the video, sees that you swallowed it, so there's certain actions you can take, opening your mouth after you eat it, etc., etc., and then sends you a video back, which is essentially feedback, saying, I've seen you take this tablet, well done, see you tomorrow, something like that. Or if you don't take it properly, can call you up and say, why haven't you taken the tablet? We design a trial, so we offer the ability to be involved in this trial to a few hundred people, and then we randomly select people to be designed into the trial or not to receive the treatment. And the reason that we have to do it like that is that if we just give it to people who'd asked for it, we may not account for the differences in attitude of those who ask for this different kind of treatment and those who don't. So it wouldn't be a properly randomized control trial. And what we find is the observed adherence almost doubles. So these are days observed of adherence, i.e. people taking the actual tablet, out of 10. 4 out of 10 for those in the old version, almost 9 out of 10 for those in the new version. But what's even more impressive is this doesn't attenuate over time. It actually sustains. Indeed, we can measure the time it takes of people to go to doctor's surgery. So actually, not only are we increasing adherence, but we're freeing people up to be more productive and do other things with their lives. That's the time spent. And finally, this one is the most impressive graph, I think. So this is the proportion of people who take at least 80% of the course. 80% is what's generally considered the minimum rate required to kill the germ. So the compliance rate moves from 15 or 16% to above 80%. Now, a lot of skeptics originally said, well, if you're giving these people tablets, you're not going to see them. They're going to disappear. We did a very simple trick. We asked people to write their name in indelible ink on the tablet. All of the tablets came back. Last couple of examples from me, then we can move into discussion. Moving on into education now. As most of us here know, learning requires self-control. This is a picture of the England football team, and I put this up here as an example of why learning requires self-control. In years where there are World Cups or European Cups, teenagers in the UK, male teenagers, do worse at their public exams because the distractions are too powerful. So how can we help children to improve their their self-control? How can we encourage them to learn? Well, parents are the obvious example, but parents need help as well because parents are busy. So actually this study of air traffic controllers showed air traffic controllers are very useful to study because you have quite a good data set of when they had busy days and non-busy days, and also it's difficult to predict which days are going to be particularly busy. So you can look back in history which days were particularly busy, and what we found, the experimenters found, was that in days that were particularly busy, those air traffic controllers who had parents were much less likely to engage with their children. So the question for policymakers is, if you want to encourage parents to help their children engage, how can we help parents engage with their children? Every term, semester, parents get a report saying this is what happened in school, this is what the kids did, and it strikes me that's really useful information. But it would be more useful if I knew about it before it happened. If I receive the information after my child has already gone through the test, I can't help them prepare. So we did this experiment with Todd Rogers at Harvard University, working with 16,000 schools, 16,000 children randomly assigned across 32 schools. We can talk about the experimental design if you're interested later. And we sent them 2 types of text. One type of text was the pre-informed text, designed to let parents know that a big test or something was going to happen. And it went something a bit like this. You can imagine parent talking to the child, what homework have you got to do this weekend? Not much. A couple of small things. Text. Dear parent, Raj has a maths test on Friday. Please remind him to study and help in any way you can. Thanks. So, your maths test on Friday. What do we need to do to get you prepared? The other type of text was a conversation prompt, just designed to encourage conversation about something that the child learned in school to help it sort of grow and remain in the memory. How was school today? Fine. What did you learn about? Nothing. Text. Hi, Raj has been learning about outer space. Ask him why in space nobody can hear you scream. If I told you dinner was ready in outer space, would you hear me? So, we conducted these texts over a year, and then we measure the outcome in performance of exams. And what we find is that maths improved significantly by the equivalent of what would have been achieved by an extra month of school teaching. But the beauty is that it cost about $10 per pupil. This study was conducted by my colleague, Dr. Raj Chande. If you want to find out more information, there is plenty available online. Finally, actually, before I move on to the final slide, it was really about more than just grades. And this was one of the nice bits of feedback that we received, making, what I present is a very kind of scientific approach to policy making, but sometimes you have to reconnect with the human side as well. And I thought this was a really nice quote to bring out. I feel connected with my daughter and her school when receiving these texts. Finally, a slightly more advanced stage of education, helping less advantaged students be more aspirational, apply to universities that are more selective, some of the elite universities. What we find in the UK is that less advantaged kids, even if they have the required grades, for various reasons don't apply to the top universities. So there are many reasons for this, which if you're interested in, we can discuss, but one of the reasons we thought is that they didn't relate to the students in those top universities. So they thought, those kind of places aren't for me. So we write to them from the government, from the Department for Education, to those students who received grades putting them in the top 25% of the country. And the letter came from a student who was less advantaged, but went to a top university. And basically, it just explained, I was a bit like you. I wasn't sure if I was going to apply to this university. But I came to realize that people with grades like you and me are in high demand from very prestigious universities. What we find is that sending the letter either to home or school, or even more so to both, result in a significantly higher proportion of less advantaged kids not only applying, but being accepted by elite universities as well. So in conclusion, what I'd just like you to leave you with, rather than, I appreciate that I've kind of given you a lot of different information about various policy areas, but the main message here is twofold. One, we can pay attention to the small details of how communication is given, how public services are presented, and it can have a really serious impact, not just on the way people feel towards public services, but actually the outcomes of their lives. And secondly, let's not assume that we know all the answers. We have to use the best evidence we have, but if we design experiments, we can continually improve. Thank you very much.